Good evening. Today is Thursday, the 24th of October, 2024, and this is a Zoom event organised by Shropshire Humanists. I'm Simon Nightingale, the chair of Shropshire Humanists. And it's my great pleasure to invite our guest speaker, Stephen Evans, who is CEO of the National Secular Society, which has a number of campaigns in common with Shropshire Humanists and Humanist UK. So, Stephen, whenever you're ready.
Right, okay. Simon, everyone, good evening. Thanks for inviting me this evening to talk about the relationship between religion and state, and the Crown, actually. Don't forget the Crown, because all three of those institutions are really mixed up in this ongoing tug of war between tradition and progress that in many ways, I think, characterise British political and public life. So our work at the National Secular Society is all about ensuring that you can live your lives free without other people's religion being imposed upon you or on wider society. We are a membership organisation, so with the support of our members, we promote secularist principles to protect freedom of and from religion. And that balance between the two, freedom of and from religion, really is the essence of secularism. That's the way I see it. So I'm going to begin with a little bit of history, if you don't mind, because it is actually still very much related to our ongoing campaigns of today. So our work began in 1866 with this man here, Charles Bradlaugh. He was a huge maverick figure in late 19th century radical politics. Bradlaugh was a liberal, he was an outspoken atheist, a radical freethinker who was elected as the Member of Parliament to Northampton in 1880, but he was denied his seat in Parliament on account of his very well-known atheist beliefs. So at the time, elected MPs had to swear a religious oath. An alternative affirmation was available for Jews and for Quakers, but not for atheists. As a known atheist, he was refused the option of swearing the religious oath. First of all, he refused. Then he said, okay, I'll take it then. But everyone knew he didn't mean it, so he was actually denied the possibility of taking the oath in the end. Nevertheless, he attempted on several occasions to take his seat in Parliament, and on one such occasion in 1881, which involved a brief physical skirmish with the Sergeant-at-Arms depicted in this slide here on the left-hand side. He tried to take his seat, he wasn't allowed to take his seat, and he was taken off to prison. He was imprisoned in a small prison cell that sits just below the clock tower on the Elizabeth Tower, just beneath the clock on the Elizabeth Tower. So that's known as Big Ben. You'll know it all as Big Ben. Just beneath the bell, there's a prison cell. And Bradlaugh was actually the last person to ever be imprisoned in that cell in Big Ben. Bradlaugh had to go on to contest 4 subsequent by-elections before he was finally allowed to take his seat. And when he did, on the right-hand side here, you can see him actually celebrating the passing of the Oaths Act, which in 1888 gave all MPs the right to affirm, so to take their seats through a secular affirmation rather than swear a religious oath. And that's a right obviously enjoyed by many MPs to this day. And the importance of Bradlaugh has been recognised in our national parliament. So in the place where Bradlaugh was once ostracised and imprisoned, there's now a portrait bust honouring him. There it is, which we worked with the Parliamentary Arts Committee to secure. That's it. So if you know Parliament, if you ever visit Parliament, then you've got Central Lobby, where in between the House of Commons and the House of Lords, you've got Central Lobby where all the TV interviews take place. Just a room adjacent to that, down a very short corridor, is the central waiting hall, it's called, and that's where you can find Charles Bradlaugh these days. So that's how we began, and since then, over the last 150 years or so, secularists have been at the forefront of many social reforms, such as the advancement of women's rights, birth control, reproductive freedom, the liberalisation of Sunday trading laws, more recently the introduction and the shaping of equality legislation, LGBT equality and rights, and the abolition of blasphemy law as well in England and Scotland. We're still working on Northern Ireland, but we're quite confident that we might see a change there too in the next couple of years. And in those struggles to bring about all of those reforms that I mentioned, the NSS has always played a prominent role and sometimes a decisive one. But there is still more to do. We continue to remain relevant as an organisation, I think, for two main reasons. Firstly, because growing religious fundamentalism really threatens to erode the freedoms that we've already won. And secondly, because we haven't yet achieved all of our ambitions, because religious privilege remains a feature of British political and public life, which of course brings me to the topic of today's talk. So despite the UK population having an increasingly secular outlook and a secular and pluralistic population, the Church of England still is officially established as the state church, and there are many privileges that flow from that. So for all of our success, there's still plenty more to do. One of the toughest nuts to crack has been disestablishment. The relationship between church and state, and of course the crown and the monarchy, hasn't often been a particularly salient political issue in Britain. Constitutional issues rarely are. But there is, I think, growing call for some sort of democratic renewal. It has risen up the political agenda recently due to several factors which I'll come on to, which I think maybe we can be a little bit more optimistic of change now than we have been for some time. But to begin, I'll just spend a little bit of time setting out what establishment is and what it looks like in a UK context. So, as many of you will know, establishment refers to the formal relationship between a church or a religion and the state it operates in. So the United Kingdom is made up of 4 countries, England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. The Church of England is only established in one of those countries. It's only established in England. There are no established churches in Northern Ireland, nor in Wales. The Church of Ireland was disestablished in 1871. Disestablishment took place in Wales in 1920. The Church of Scotland does have special status in Scotland, but it is wholly independent of the state. Now, the most visible manifestation of Anglican establishment is probably the reigning monarch, the king, being both head of state as well as head of the church, holding the titles of Supreme Governor of the Church of England and Defender of the Faith. And for the avoidance of doubt, that faith is the one true Protestant faith. Now, these titles date back to the reign of King Henry VIII and England's, England's break from Rome and the authority of the Pope, and the break away from the Catholic Church, basically. And it is a requirement in law for our monarch to be in communion with the Church of England. So this means our head of state really needs to be a practicing Protestant Christian. So we reserve the role of head of state for practicing Christians. Now, you'll recall the coronation of King Charles, which took place not too long ago. This was a state occasion, but it was primarily a religious affair. During the ceremony, our head of state vowed to maintain the Protestant religion, to maintain and preserve the settlement of the Church of England and its doctrine and its worship, preserve the rights and privileges of bishops, such as seats in the House of Lords. The sovereign was then anointed with holy oil. He had holy oil rubbed all over his chest. He was blessed, and then he was consecrated by the Archbishop of Canterbury. So the event was largely unnecessary. It was more for the church than it was for the monarch or the country. No other European monarch has a coronation. The death of an existing monarch is what makes a new monarch, not a coronation. So it wasn't necessary for that purpose. In fact, the human rights barrister and constitutional expert Geoffrey Robinson described the coronation as a legal irrelevance, just a silly and superstitious Church of England ritual. Charles had no need at all to be crowned by a minority church. It was an expensive irrelevance too. Our request for information on the state spending of the coronation have so far been refused, but we will eventually know the cost. Now, the previous coronation, the coronation of Queen Elizabeth, took place in June 1953. Since then, Britain's religion and belief landscape has changed a lot. Religious adherence and church attendance has gone downhill, it's plummeted. Minority religions have grown, as has non-belief. Nevertheless, the King's coronation looked and felt very similar to the previous one. There was a slight nod to multi-faithism this time. Various faith leaders, including the Humanist UK's chief executive, attended. Some of them were even allowed to carry the King's gloves at one point. But it was an unmistakably Anglican affair. The point of the coronation is for the King to be anointed by the Archbishop of Canterbury to transform the King into an agent of God. That's the whole purpose of it. And all of this overlapping of church and head of state, I think, really entrenches religious privilege in the UK, and it gives the monarchy a kind of quasi-religious character. And the monarchy's religious role is really underpinned by this assumption that all future monarchs will be believing Anglicans. And as I'll come on to a little bit later on, I don't think that's any longer a safe assumption to make. Now, the question of whether we should retain a monarchy at all is a different one. It perhaps goes beyond the secularist remit, albeit a large proportion of certainly NSS members, I think, will have Republican sympathies or tendencies. If the royal family's legitimacy heralds from a divine right to rule, then where does that legitimacy come from in a post-Enlightenment society that no longer recognises the divine right of kings? You could, of course, argue, and many do, that it doesn't come from the divine right of kings. It comes from the will of the people. But since the King's coronation, support for the monarchy has reduced. Around 60% of British people still support a monarchy in the UK, but only 37% of 18 to 24-year-olds. So there may well be trouble ahead for the crown. But if we are to have a head of state, someone to represent all of us and protect all of our rights and freedoms, we argue that that role should be secular and free from any sort of religious entanglement. So that's one pillar of establishment, the monarchy. Now, another pillar of establishment, another manifestation of church establishment is the bishop's bench. So this is the right, the automatic right of 26 Anglican clerics to sit as lawmakers in our upper chamber, the House of Lords. Now, the UK is the only national parliament in Europe to have any sort of explicit religious representation. Outside of Europe, only Iran, a theocracy, has such an arrangement in its national parliament. The Isle of Man, which is a British Crown dependency, also has one Anglican bishop as of right. But maybe not for much longer. The Isle of Man is self-governing, and there is legislation currently going through to remove the bishop's vote. A recent consultation on the legislation found that 51% of people of the Isle of Man supported the bishop's vote being removed. They also supported the removal of prayers before sittings too, by a margin of 52 to 48%. So there may be some change afoot there. They may actually lead the way on this. But back in the Westminster Parliament, all sessions there begin with Anglican prayers, both in the House of Commons and in the House of Lords. This is not really written down anywhere in the procedures. It's more a case of custom and practice. We have lobbied with MPs and Lords for the removal of prayers, but neither the Speaker or the Procedures Committee seem willing to reconsider that practice for now. The Labour government has actually set up a modernisation committee, so we are now engaging with them on this issue. There is always at least one bishop in the House of Lords when the House is sitting, but there are often several. I attend the House of Commons quite regularly with my work. I always see bishops around doing lobbying when they're there. There are often several in there, especially when there's a particular interest the church has a particular interest in what's been debated, such as assisted dying, for example, when the bishops' benches were absolutely full. The last time assisted dying was actually debated in the House of Lords, the bishops said they were united in their opposition to any sort of reform, and the church, of course, still opposes it to this day. Bishops in the House of Lords, they're treated with a unique deference. When a bishop stands up to speak, everyone else has to sit down. There's lots of turn taking that goes on in the House of Lords, but that doesn't apply to bishops. As soon as a bishop stands up, there's cries of "Bishop, Bishop," everyone else has to sit down and the bishops get to speak. They can take part in all the business of the House, including tabling and answering questions of ministers, leading or speaking in debates, scrutinising legislation, voting, of course, and serving on parliamentary committees. As I say, when they stand to speak, all other peers give way by convention. The most recent example of that actually was just a couple of months ago when Baroness Jenny Jones was drowned out to cries of "Bishop, Bishop." She sat down and the bishop spoke. And this kind of religious deference, I think, really does democracy no favours. But the privilege of seats in the House of Lords, what I'm trying to say is it extends far beyond the right to vote. It's their influence in the voting in the House of Lords is quite modest. They rarely tip the balance one way or the other. But what the access to Parliament does, and the 26 automatic seats does, it gives bishops a really unique access to ministers, lawmakers, and the corridors of power. Influence far beyond any other religious or secular special interest group could dream of. Now, a 2021 YouGov survey found that 16% of British people believe bishops should be entitled to a seat in the House of Lords. So the bishop's role, as you can see, is not popular amongst the public. A recent survey of Church of England clergy themselves found that many of those clergy are actually in favour of reform, with around half of C of E clergy thinking that seats reserved for them or their bishops should actually be shared with other faith leaders. Now, this isn't the kind of reform that we would be in favour of. Religious interests are already very well represented in the House of Lords by ordinary peers. I think the whole concept of reserved seats for faith leaders is nonsensical in a modern liberal democracy. And a multi-faith approach of appointing a variety of peers to represent various religious groups would, I think, be quite divisive and wholly unworkable anyway. It throws up just so many different practical problems in terms of who represents which religion and why. Do the non-religious get a look in? Maybe that's something we can explore afterwards in questions, because it is really a serious thing that comes up. Whenever people talk about removing the bishop's bench, people say, you know, what we need is a multi-faith approach so we get other faith leaders in there. I struggle to believe it's a serious suggestion, but it really is. I would simply argue for seats as of right for religious leaders to be removed. Now, the new Labour government has brought forward quite early in its term in office the House of Lords Hereditary Peers Bill. So this is a bill that will remove the 96 hereditary peers. Unfortunately, it doesn't touch the bishops. But I would say the participation of the bishops in Parliament is equally absurd. It's a hangover from the Middle Ages when, like the hereditary peers, they were feudal landholders. With the abolition of the right of hereditary peers to sit, the bishops will be the only members of the House with a right of succession, albeit not hereditary succession, but on the basis of their position in the Church of England. So while we at the National Secular Society absolutely support Labour's efforts to modernise the House of Lords, the exclusion of bishops from these proposals really represents a serious missed opportunity for meaningful reform. So with that in mind, we've actually been working with the former Secretary of State for Defence and Education, Gavin Williamson, who seems to support us on this. He has tabled an amendment to the Hereditary Peers Bill that would actually remove the automatic right of 26 bishops to sit. So I've got a little video here, hopefully, if it plays, of Gavin Williamson speaking in the House of Commons just a week or so ago.
There is a big opportunity here. There is an unfairness. There is an injustice. There's so many people of so many faiths and so many people of no faith at all. See the fact that there are 26 bishops. These are not reflective of the United Kingdom and are not reflective of what this country looks like today. That they are still there. So I will, if a government is not willing to table an amendment, I will table an amendment to remove those 26 bishops from this House. And I hope, as I give way to the honourable gentleman, as to whether he will support me in that mission to make the upper house a fairer and more reflective chamber. There is a...
So, there you go. For some of you, that may be the first time you've ever agreed with Gavin Williamson, I imagine. So you can actually help us in getting support behind that amendment via our website, via our newsletter. We've got platforms where you can actually write to your MP to ask them to back the amendment. Now, I can't guarantee that this amendment will be successful this time because Labour are not supporting it for now. But, you know, if the hereditary peers do go, then the bishops will really stick out like a sore thumb. Now, another aspect of establishment is the role that Parliament plays in church governance. So, the King appoints an Anglican MP from the governing party to be an intermediary between church and state, and I suppose hold the church accountable to Parliament by answering questions and to speak officially on behalf of the Church of England in Parliament too. So Andrew Selous was the previous one, Conservative MP. He's gone, like so many other Conservative MPs, so we've got a new second Church Estates Commissioner, as the post is called, in Marcia de Cordova. Now, Marcia apparently attends the Evangelical Holy Trinity network of churches. Many of you will be familiar with the Alpha Course. Well, that was the brainchild of the Holy Trinity network. Very evangelical church. So many of the internal laws passed by the Church of England's decision-making body, the General Synod, must be approved by both Houses of Parliament before they can come into effect. So this means that although governance of the Church of England has largely been delegated to the General Synod, Parliament still remains legislatively supreme. So in many ways, the Church is subservient to Parliament. In fact, Parliament has the authority to pass laws affecting doctrine and the internal workings of the Church without the Church's involvement. By convention, it doesn't do that, but it certainly has, our Parliament certainly has the power to do that. The state also plays a key role in filling positions within the Church. So bishops and archbishops are appointed by the ruling monarch, acting on advice from the Prime Minister. So until the mid-1970s, the Prime Minister had an unfettered right to advise on appointments, and the Church actually had no formal role in the appointment process of its own bishops or archbishops at all. It was usually consulted as a matter of courtesy, but it was very much the Prime Minister's decision who became the next bishop of wherever or the archbishop. So the role of the Prime Minister in selecting or advising on archbishops becomes a bit problematic if the Prime Minister isn't themselves an Anglican, and particularly if they're a Catholic, because under the law, no person professing to be a Roman Catholic is allowed to advise the Queen on the selection of Church of England bishops. So this rule dates back to 1701, the Act of Settlement, which was a law to ensure Protestant succession to the English throne. Now, this became a bit of a problem a few years ago because this very anti-Catholic piece of legislation put our Catholic former Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, in a difficult situation. Instead, another minister had to be drafted in to advise the Queen on who the next bishop should be. Bizarrely, our former Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, who's a practicing Hindu, and our current MP, Keir Starmer, who's an atheist, they can advise the King on the selection of bishops. Only Catholics are explicitly banned. Appointments to other church positions, such as deans, deacons and priests, are also shaped by the views of state officials too. So there's plenty of church interference going on in state affairs, yes, but there's also plenty of state meddling going on in what I think should be church affairs. As a secularist, I don't support that. I think the Church of England, like all other religions, should enjoy complete independence from the state. Now, perhaps another aspect of establishment is the continued role that the church plays in state education in Britain. The role that the Church of England and the Catholic Church and now other faith groups play in our schools is very much stemming from the privileged role that the church generally enjoys in our political and civic life. So it means we've got a quarter of our primary schools in England run by the Church of England, which gives the church really significant influence over education policy in the education sector. And this is the reason why I think we still have a law requiring a daily act of collective worship in all schools. We have an exemption from equality law that allows church schools to discriminate in their admissions in favour of churchgoers and to select teachers based on their faith and sometimes sexual orientation. And also while we have an outdated version of religious education that allows religious groups to largely determine the syllabus. And because the Church of England runs schools, it means that other faith groups now have been allowed and even encouraged to run schools, because you can't allow the Church of England to run schools and then turn around and say no to Muslim, Hindu, Jewish and Sikh schools. So we now have schools segregated along religious, racial and ethnic lines, which is a wholly regressive approach to state education that really, I think, undermines integration and cohesion. So the presence of an established church and the Church of England's influence over education policy is, I think, a pretty significant barrier to us achieving a truly secular education system free from religious discrimination and control. Due to its established status, the church also has a prominent ceremonial role as well. There you go, there's a picture of the remembrance. If you ever watch that, sometimes the annual ceremony will resemble a church service, because the Bishop of London leads Christian prayers at the ceremony. But if remembrance is important, and I think it is, then I think it needs to be meaningful to people. If it's not meaningful, people will switch off, and if they switch off, they forget. And given that religion is such a turn-off for so many people, particularly younger people, I think our national remembrance and other national occasions having this religious flavour is, I would say, far from ideal. So that's what establishment looks like in the United Kingdom. There are two principal objections to there being an established church. So first, it's unfair, the existence of a legally enshrined national religion and established church privileges just one part of the population, one institution, and one set of beliefs. So it undermines the principle, I think, of equal citizenship. The second objection is that it's archaic and it's inauthentic, because we're no longer a Christian country. Christianity, for sure, is one major influence among many that shape our current way of life in Britain and the values that we share. But these values of tolerance, justice, fairness, they're not, as I'm sure you'll agree, religion-specific values. They're secular values too. So we can't, in any meaningful way, I think, be described as a Christian country. And even the Anglican clergy seem to agree with us on this. So a recent poll commissioned by the Times newspaper found that 64% of Anglican clergy think that Britain can no longer be described as a Christian country. Now, I mentioned earlier that there are reasons why we might be a little bit more hopeful of change now than perhaps we have been for some time. And that's because several things have happened recently that have started, I think, to perfectly illustrate the objections that I mentioned. The death of Queen Elizabeth quite recently meant that we had a coronation for the first time in 70 years. And I think this brought the relationship between the state and the church into focus, and means our head of state's role of defender of the faith has been and will continue, I think, to be opened up to scrutiny. So King Charles, before he was king, made clear his intention to be a defender of faith generally, not just defender of the faith. So this fits with the role that the Church of England has sort of assumed for itself in promoting a multi-faith rather than a secular Britain. They claim to be a voice for all faiths. The Church of England very much wants to be a means by which other denominations and faith communities can be privileged or elevated in public life. But of course, only on the basis that the Church of England is uniquely privileged. But when push came to a shove, the coronation, absolutely nothing changed. The king became defender of the faith. So all the talk of being defender of faith went out the window, and the king took his vows and became defender of the faith. And despite the king's very vocal support for religious freedom, the monarch's religious role is, as I say, underpinned by this assumption that all future monarchs will be believing Anglicans. And as I said again earlier, I don't think that can be assumed anymore. There is growing speculation as to whether the Prince of Wales will want to take the title of Supreme Governor of the Church of England when he eventually becomes king. William, like most people of his generation, isn't a regular churchgoer. According to a recent book by Robert Hardman, a royal biographer, it's no secret that William does not share the king's sense of the spiritual, let alone the late Queen's unshakable devotion to the Anglican Church. A senior palace figure has been quoted saying that Prince William is not instinctively comfortable in a faith environment. But, as I said again earlier, under the Act of Settlement 1701, Prince William could not become king without first being in communion with the Church of England. Now, this criteria maybe could be met on account of his baptism when he had little choice in the matter, but the optics of a supreme governor of the Church of England and a defender of the faith not being particularly religious would, I think, really undermine both church and state. I think it would be somewhat embarrassing and demeaning for the Church of England to have a supreme governor and defender of the faith that doesn't even practice the faith or believe in its doctrine. Removing the religious role of our head of state would, I think, remove the restriction on the monarch's freedom of religion or belief too, signalling, I think, the UK and the King's true commitment to this important principle of freedom of religion or belief. I think everyone should have the right to choose their beliefs, and I think the King should be included there too. So these things really should be separated. I think the role of head of state being for Christians only is really at odds with the monarch's supposed support for freedom of religion or belief, and it contravenes every principle of non-discrimination ever drawn up. Our head of state should be free to hold any religious belief they wish. Under our current constitution, that is just not possible. Not only does Anglican establishment make second-class citizens out of non-Anglicans, though, it also makes second-class citizens out of lesbian and gay people. So in recent years, the Archbishop of Canterbury has reaffirmed the Church's official rejection of gay sex and still refuses to carry out same-sex marriages, which of course are perfectly legal in Britain. Of course, the Church's doctrine is its own affair, and many clergy are absolutely at odds with its Church's own doctrine on this. But as we've been pointed out in this advert that we ran in the gay press not too long ago, it is problematic for an officially homophobic institution to be an arm of the state. As the former MP Ben Bradshaw said just last year, the overwhelming view of MPs is that it is not sustainable for our established church to be institutionally homophobic and to actively exclude a portion of the population whom they have a duty to serve. So the issue of same-sex marriage is certainly a divisive one in the church. It's an issue which the Church of England could eventually split over. A majority, 53% of C of E clergy, think the church should allow priests to choose to conduct same-sex weddings if they want to, and 65% believe the church's teachings that homosexual practice is incompatible with scripture should be dropped. But for the foreseeable future, there's no prospect of this doctrine changing. Mainly because they want to avoid a schism in the broader Anglican communion. So the CRV's conservative position on issues such as sexuality has really alienated from the majority of the British people, including those in the pews who go to church every Sunday, and the clergy who are more liberal in their outlook. Now, the Archbishop of Canterbury has said he would rather see the church disestablished than split over same-sex marriage. So, as I say, this may still be the issue that triggers the breakup of the Anglican communion, but it could also be the issue that triggers disestablishment. Now, increasing secularization and religious diversity highlights not only the unfairness of the status quo, which I've been talking about, but also the absurdity of it. The most recent census, which was published last year, showed that the percentage of Christians in England and Wales now has fallen from 72% in 2001 to 59% in 2011, and now to 46% in 2021. So that's going down 13 percentage points every 10 years. And if it continues at that rate, it's going to be a very, very small percentage by the year 2050. But already Christians are in a minority situation, and lots of polling in recent years paints a picture of declining faith and growing non-religiosity. So let's just have a look. The UK is the 6th least religious country in the world. Social attitude surveys have found that half of British people have no religion, which goes up to around 70% of those aged 18 to 24. Just 0.9% of the English population worship in Anglican churches on the average Sunday, which you'll note is some way short of the 46% of people who say they're Christians in the census. Just 1% of young adults say they identify with the Church of England. But it's not just about affiliation, it's about attitudes too. So 60% of Brits say that religion isn't important in their lives. 81% agree that religious practice is a private matter and should be separated from the political and economic life of the country. More of us oppose than support the idea of the UK having an official state religion. 58% of adults oppose state-funded religious schools. British citizens, including churchgoers, overwhelmingly reject the church's position on social issues such as abortion, assisted dying, and same-sex marriage. So establishment doesn't just sit well with reality. It's very much a hangover from a bygone age, out of date, and not very inclusive. So ever increasing secularity and falling affiliation in the Church of England and a growing religious diversity, I think, is another reason why disestablishment is desirable now and perhaps inevitable. There are also arguments for disestablishment coming from an Anglican and a broader Christian perspective too. So some Anglicans within the church itself are arguing that the church should voluntarily relinquish its privileges and its established status to free the church to pursue its own mission with greater authenticity. And going back to that recent survey I mentioned in the Times, it found that more than half of Church of England priests think the church's established status should be reviewed, including 12% of priests who absolutely say the Church of England should be disestablished. And at a recent event we organised in Parliament, we gave a platform actually to Anglicans who want greater church autonomy and recognise the importance of state impartiality when it comes to religion. So they echo our call for disestablishment. Because if secularism is going to succeed, we really need the religious moderates on side. And that's very much part of our strategy at the National Secular Society. We really do want to be an umbrella for everyone who believes in the principle of church-state separation. And we need to be very mindful that some of the most eloquent arguments for disestablishment are actually coming from within the Church of England itself. Now, the Archbishop of Canterbury has suggested that disestablishment wouldn't be a disaster for the Church of England, but he also made it clear that the Church would not be initiating the change, at least not yet. So for the time being, those who benefit from religious establishment, the bishops most notably, they seem keen to preserve it, particularly, of course, the bishops whose seats in the House of Lords give them significant political lobbying power and plenty of prestige. But bishops aside, I think many Christians would, as I say, support disestablishment. And I say this really to point out that disestablishment need not be this big clash between church and state, or the religious and the non-religious. I think it really could be progressed with the mutual understanding that a formal separation could stand to benefit both. All sides, I think, should be able to recognise that maintaining a minority established church in a religiously pluralistic and largely secularised society isn't particularly sustainable. It gets in the way, I think, as well, of forging a more inclusive British identity that all citizens can feel equally part of. So these are the points that we've been making in our lobbying and advocacy work in the media for many years. We did actually work with a peer quite recently as well to draft a bill to disestablish the Church of England. The bill was actually introduced into Parliament last December by the Lib Dem peer Paul Scriven, pictured here. But unfortunately, because the Conservatives called an earlier than expected election, the bill wasn't able to be debated before Parliament was prorogued for the election. But we will aim to bring the bill back and just see what support it might muster. But we know that radical change in our culturally at least small c conservative country is a significant challenge. We are up against a very strong and determined religious establishment that's really trying hard to regain its lost influence. And as a country, I think we are very fond of our traditions as well. But that love of tradition really shouldn't stand in the way of reforms to make the British state fit for the 21st century. I am optimistic though. I think the UK's drift away from Christianity looks set to continue. All the trends, declining religious belief, an ageing congregation means Christianity will certainly continue to decline, I think. At the same time, non-religiosity and minority faiths, and particularly Islam, are seeing significant growth in the UK. So Anglicanism may, for now, be the most widely practiced religion, but there's absolutely no guarantee that that's going to continue to be the case. It almost certainly won't. So other religions may well, with some justification, seek the privileges currently enjoyed by the Church of England. But already the majoritarian argument for an established church, that's gone. And that was actually the what triggered disestablishment in Wales. It was when it was just very clear that it didn't represent the majority of the population in Wales. That's when disestablishment was triggered. We've now reached that position in the UK, where in England and Wales, certainly the Church of England is very much in minority position now. But also the countless scandals and the cover-ups of abuse which have been rampant in the church, not only the Catholic Church, the Church of England too. I think they give lie to any claims that it acts as the nation's moral compass. The argument from tradition isn't really a valid argument at all. It really reveals the absence of one, I would suggest. Arguments that it's too difficult to achieve, well, they suggest an alarming democratic deficit there. If we, the people, are powerless over our own constitution, more the reason to get on with reform, I would suggest. But I would also recognise that there's no great clamour for disestablishment at present, but overt support for the status quo for establishment is very weak. We are seeing a sustained and ongoing process of secularisation, increasing levels of cultural diversity, and the growing divergence between the ethical views of church leaders and the views of wider British society will undoubtedly make current justifications for establishment even harder to sustain. So I think it's more of a question of when, not if, but obviously it's our job the National Secular Society to make that happen as soon as possible, because I think it's pretty clear that we need a long-term sustainable settlement on the relationship between religion and the state, and that settlement should be based on the principles of secularism. That means equality for all, irrespective of religion or belief, freedom of religion or belief, and a clear separation between religion and state. Okay, that's all from me. Thanks for listening.
Well, thank you very much, Stephen, for a fascinating and informative talk, and for inspiring us to take up arms to overturn an anachronistic religious hegemony that has no place in the 21st century United Kingdom. Thank you very much indeed.